I was born into a world that did not promise me anything. No comfort. No certainty. No guarantee that I would survive long enough to become a man, let alone a name spoken across oceans. My name is Edson Arantes do Nascimento, but the world would come to know me as Pelé. And before I was anything close to a legend, I was just a boy from a poor home in Três Corações, Brazil, growing up with empty pockets, but a heart full of dreams I did not yet know how to explain. This is my story, not as it is told in trophies and headlines, but as I lived it, from hunger, struggle, and pain, to greatness the world still debates how to measure. The first time I understood what humiliation felt like, I was still a child. Not because someone insulted me directly, but because I saw the look people gave poor families. That look stays with you. The look that says, they probably won't become anything. Their lives are already decided. They belong down there. Poverty teaches you awareness long before adulthood arrives. You notice who gets respected. You notice who gets ignored. You notice how money changes the way people speak to each other. And when you grow up with little, you learn to carry invisible shame without even realizing it. There were days my clothes were worn thin. Days my stomach hurt from hunger. Days I tried to smile while feeling smaller than everyone around me. But football became the only place where none of that mattered. On the street, nobody cared how poor you were if you could play. The ball equalized everything. And for a few moments each day, I stopped being the poor boy. I became dangerous. My father saw it before others did. He saw how obsessed I was becoming. Not just passionate, obsessed. I played constantly. Morning, afternoon, evening. I studied movement without knowing I was studying it. I watched older players closely, how they shifted weight, how they trapped the ball, how they deceived defenders before touching the ball at all. Football was becoming more than a game. It was becoming escape. But my father also feared something. He feared disappointment. Because he had lived it himself. He had once dreamed too. An injury took everything from him. I remember watching sadness pass through his eyes sometimes when he looked at me play. Not jealousy. Not bitterness. Fear. Fear that football would break me too. Fear that I would build my entire soul around a dream that could disappear in one bad moment. And the older I became, the more I understood his fear. Football can love you one day and abandon you the next. When I joined local youth teams, reality became harsher. Talent attracts pressure quickly. At first, people cheer for gifted children. Then they expect perfection from them. I began hearing adults speak about me differently. This boy is special. He could go far. He plays beyond his age. At first, those words felt exciting. Then they became heavy. Because once people expect greatness, mistakes stop being normal. A bad game suddenly matters. One failure becomes a conversation. One mischance becomes criticism. And I was still just a boy trying to survive emotionally while learning who I even was. There were nights I lay awake wondering, what if I fail? What if everyone is wrong about me? What if this dream disappears? People think confidence removes fear. It does not. Confidence often exists beside fear. The difference is whether fear controls you. By the time Santos entered my life, I already understood sacrifice. But leaving home still hurt more than I expected. People romanticize opportunity. They rarely talk about loneliness. I miss my family deeply. I miss familiar streets. I miss my mother's voice. I miss the small routines of ordinary life. At Santos, I entered a world filled with competition. Everybody wanted something. Everybody was chasing survival. Everybody feared being replaced. Football at that level was no longer innocent. It became ruthless. One bad performance and people questioned your future. One injury and someone else took your position. One moment of weakness and confidence could collapse. I trained harder than ever before because I understood something terrifying. Talent opens doors. Discipline keeps them open. There were players more naturally gifted than me who disappeared because they lacked consistency. I could not afford that. Not with my background. Not with my family depending on possibility. Every training session carried emotional weight. Because failure no longer affected only me. It affected everyone connected to me. My first professional appearances felt unreal. The stadium lights. The noise. The pressure. I remember realizing how fast professional football truly was. The game moved differently. Defenders were smarter. Challenges were harder. Space disappeared instantly. For a moment, I doubted myself. Not publicly. Internally. I wondered, am I truly ready for this level? And that question haunted me early on. Because there is a difference between dreaming about greatness and standing inside it. Dreams are safe from distance. Reality tests you immediately. But then something happened. Instinct took over. The same instincts built on dusty streets. The same creativity born from poverty. I stopped trying to play like everyone else. And I started playing like myself. That changed everything. Goals began coming regularly. Crowds reacted differently when I touched the ball. Defenders became nervous around me. Newspapers started writing my name. And suddenly, life accelerated faster than my mind could process. I was becoming famous before I fully understood adulthood. That is dangerous. Because fame distorts reality. People begin praising you constantly. Protecting you from criticism. Treating you differently. And if you are not careful, you begin believing you are untouchable. But life always corrects arrogance eventually. Always. The 1958 World Cup changed my existence forever. But people often forget how emotionally overwhelming it was. I was only 17 years old. 17. At that age, most boys are still trying to understand themselves. And I was standing on the biggest football stage on earth carrying national expectation. The pressure was enormous. Brazil had suffered painful World Cup disappointments before. The country desperately wanted redemption. And when I became part of that journey, the emotional atmosphere surrounding us became intense. I remember moments of nervousness so strong I could barely calm my thoughts. People think legends walk into greatness fearless. That is not true. Sometimes we are terrified. We simply move forward anyway. When injury threatened my tournament early on, fear hit me hard. Not physical fear. Emotional fear. Fear of losing my chance. Fear of becoming irrelevant before my story even began. Fear that destiny might pass me by. Sitting out matches felt unbearable. Watching others play while uncertainty consumed me was torture. And in those quiet moments, I learned patience in suffering. Because not every battle is fought publicly. Some battles happen internally while the world sees only silence. Then came the matches that changed everything. I began playing freely. Not because pressure disappeared, but because I stopped fighting it. I accepted it. And once I accepted it, football flowed naturally again. The goal against Wales. The brilliance against France. The final against Sweden. Those moments became history. But inside me, they felt strangely human. Not mythical. Not magical. Human. A young boy trying to hold himself together while the world suddenly exploded around him. After we won the World Cup, people celebrated wildly. Brazil erupted with joy. And I cried uncontrollably. Not polished tears for cameras. Real tears. Because I thought about my family. My childhood. My father's broken dreams. The barefoot streets. The hunger. I realized then that football had done something impossible. It had carried me beyond the limits poverty tried to place on my life. But success changes relationships. Some people genuinely celebrate you. Others resent what you become. Fame reveals truth about human nature quickly. There were people who suddenly appeared wanting closeness. People wanting money. People wanting access. People wanting pieces of success they never helped build. Learning who to trust became difficult. Very difficult. And loneliness can exist even inside admiration. That surprised me most. The more famous I became, the more isolated parts of my life felt. because very few people truly understood the pressure I lived under daily. The world saw smiles, celebrations, goals, but they did not see exhaustion, painkiller injections, mental fatigue, fear of decline. Athletes learned to hide suffering professionally. As years passed, defenders became more aggressive toward me. Some wanted to stop me legally. Others did not care how they stopped me. I was kicked constantly. There were matches where I left the field bruised badly. The 1966 World Cup remains painful in my memory for that reason. The fouls were brutal. I was targeted relentlessly. At one point, frustration consumed me so deeply I questioned whether I even wanted to continue playing international football. People think legends always feel honored by the game. Sometimes we feel betrayed by it too. But pain changes you. And eventually it changed my style. I became wiser, more efficient, more strategic. Youth relies heavily on energy. Experience relies on timing. I no longer needed to outrun everyone constantly. I learned how to control rhythm itself. That understanding elevated my game beyond pure athleticism. Football became psychological. I learned how defenders thought, how fear affected opponents, how confidence shifted momentum. By 1970, I was no longer simply a gifted young star. I had become complete. And that Brazilian team, it felt almost spiritual at times. The connection between us was extraordinary. Every movement felt understood before it happened. That World Cup became more than victory. It became art. People still speak about it because it represented football played with freedom, intelligence, and joy simultaneously. And when we lifted the trophy again, I felt something different from 1958. Back then, I felt disbelief. In 1970, I felt fulfillment. A journey completed. But aging is unavoidable. The body slows gradually. Recovery takes longer. Pain lingers deeper. And athletes feel time approaching before fans do. You begin noticing tiny changes, a slower reaction. More fatigue after matches. Longer healing periods. Those small realities force difficult reflection. Because eventually, every athlete faces the same truth. The game continues without you. No amount of greatness changes that. Retirement frightened me more than people realized. Because identity built entirely around performance becomes fragile once performance ends. Who was Pelé without football? That question haunted me quietly. I had spent my entire life being watched, celebrated, expected to shine. And suddenly, silence became possible again. At first, that silence felt uncomfortable. Then eventually, peaceful. For the first time in decades, I could observe life without constantly preparing for the next match. And reflection brought clarity. I began understanding that my story was never only about football. Football was simply the vehicle. The deeper story was transformation. A poor black boy from Brazil becoming proof that circumstance does not always determine destiny. That is what people connected to emotionally. Not just the goals. Hope. And hope is powerful. Because millions of poor children saw themselves in me. Not perfection. Not privilege. Possibility. That mattered more than statistics ever could. Even now, when people debate greatness, records, comparisons, I understand the conversation. But legacy is not only numbers. Legacy is emotional impact. Legacy is inspiration surviving generations. Legacy is a child somewhere believing their life can become larger because they saw yours. And if I gave the world anything lasting, I hope it was that feeling. The feeling that impossible things can still happen. Even for boys born with nothing. I am Pelé. But before that name meant anything to the world, it meant struggle. It meant hunger. It meant resilience. And if there is anything my life teaches, it is this. Greatness is not born where life is easy. It is born where giving up would have been easier, but was never chosen. Lionel Messi. The boy who was too small for his dream. I was born in Rosario, Argentina. Not into fame. Not into comfort. not into certainty. I was born into a world that would quickly decide what I could and could not become. From the beginning, my body was different. Smaller. Fragile. Easily overlooked. While other children grew into their frames, I remained behind, like my body had forgotten the instructions of time. They would later call it a condition. Growth hormone deficiency. But to me, it was simpler and heavier than a medical term. It was rejection from the future before I even reached it. The first signs of being less. I remember football before I remember fear. A ball at my feet made everything quiet inside me. Not because I was the best, but because I was free. But freedom has limits when your body refuses to grow with your dreams. On the pitch, I was always the smallest. The others ran like they owned gravity. I ran like I was borrowing time. And yet, I never stopped. Because when I touched the ball, something in me felt larger than my body could hold. The diagnosis that changed everything. Then came the words that split my childhood in two. Doctors. Tests. Silence. My parents standing still, trying not to break in front of me. And then the truth. My body was not producing enough growth hormones. Without treatment, I would remain small. Too small for professional football. Too small for the future I was building inside my imagination. Treatment existed, but it was expensive. Too expensive for my family. Each injection was not just medicine. It was money. Money we didn't have. I didn't understand finances at the time. But I understood something deeper. Even my body now had a price tag. The invisible struggle at home. My father worked. My mother worried in silence. Every conversation about my treatment carried weight that I could feel even when I was not included in it. I would sit nearby, pretending not to listen. But I heard everything. Sacrifices. Calculations. Doubt disguised as planning. There were nights when I could sense decisions being made without words. Should we continue? Can we continue? What if we cannot continue? And I remember thinking, if I stop treatment, do I stop being possible? That thought stayed with me longer than any medicine. The pain of being small in a big game. Football didn't become easier. It became cruel. Opponents didn't need to hate me. They only needed to be bigger. Coaches didn't need to reject me loudly. They only needed to doubt me quietly. And silence is sometimes louder than insult. I was often overlooked in selection. Passed over. Placed aside. Not because I lack skill, but because I lack size. And in football, size often speaks before talent gets a chance. But the ball always listened to me. There was something strange that I could not explain. When I dribbled, the world slowed. When I moved with the ball, space changed shape. Not because I was strong, but because I was precise. While others fought physics, I studied angles. While others relied on power, I relied on rhythm. The ball did not care how tall I was. The ball only responded to truth. And I was always honest with it. The moment everything could have ended. There was a point where many would have stopped. Where logic would have won over passion. Where reality would have crushed imagination. Because who invests in a child whose body refuses to grow? Who believes in a dream that looks medically impossible? Even I sometimes felt it. Maybe this is not for me. Maybe football belongs to others. Maybe I am only meant to love the game from a distance. But every time I thought that, I touched the ball again. And it answered me like it was waiting. A family on the edge of a decision. My father tried to carry responsibility. My mother carried emotion. Together, they carried uncertainty. And I carried silence. Because I didn't want to become another burden. But I also didn't know how to stop being a dreamer. There was no backup plan inside me. Only football. Only movement. Only hope disguised as obsession. And when hope becomes the only thing you own, you protect it even when it hurts. The world I could not yet reach. While other boys were growing into academies, contracts, and attention, I was growing into patience. While others were being measured by height and strength, I was being measured by doubt. And still I played. Because something inside me refused to accept limitation as identity. Not because I was brave, but because I had nothing else. There comes a moment in some lives where childhood ends quietly. Not with age. Not with maturity. But with a decision. Mine arrived when football stopped being just a game and became survival. Because by then, the truth had become impossible to ignore. My treatment was expensive. My future was uncertain. And Argentina, my home, my streets, my people, could no longer guarantee either football or healing. I was still a child. But suddenly my life sounded like an adult problem. There are moments that don't look historic while they are happening. A conversation. A meeting. A possibility. That was Barcelona. A club thousands of miles away from everything I knew. A club powerful enough to offer what my family could not afford. Treatment. Opportunity. A future. But opportunities are strange things. Sometimes they arrive dressed as sacrifice. Because accepting Barcelona did not just mean football. It meant leaving home. Leaving Rosario. Leaving familiarity. Leaving childhood behind before I was ready. People talk about success like it begins with excitement. Mine began with separation. I remember the emotional weight of departure more than the physical journey itself. The silence in my family. The uncertainty hidden behind encouragement. Everyone wanted this chance to work. But nobody knew what it would cost us emotionally. I was young enough to still need comfort. Yet old enough to understand pressure. And pressure changes childhood. Suddenly every training session felt important. Every touch mattered. Every mistake carried fear. Because now this was bigger than me. My family had risked everything. How could I fail after that? Spain did not feel like home. Not at first. Everything was different. The language sounded different. The rhythm of life felt different. Even football felt different. At Barcelona's academy, talent was everywhere. For the first time in my life, being gifted was not special. Everyone there was gifted. Everyone dreamed. Everyone wanted the same future. And when every player is talented, the smallest weakness becomes visible. Mine was still my body. The treatments did not magically disappear when I arrived in Spain. The injections continued. Night after night. Routine after routine. Pain after pain. People see trophies now. They see celebrations. They see greatness. But they do not see the child pressing medicine into his body hoping it would allow him to keep up with his dream. Those injections became part of my identity. A reminder that my journey was never natural. Every inch my body gained felt fought for. Earned. Purchased through endurance. Football academies are filled with boys. But loneliness still exists there. Especially when you are far from home. Especially when your family struggles emotionally. Especially when you are trying to prove you deserve sacrifices others made for you. There were moments I missed Argentina so deeply it physically hurt. The streets. The voices. The comfort of familiarity. Even simple things began to feel sacred in memory. And homesickness is dangerous because it whispers questions into your mind. Was this worth it? Do I belong here? What if I never become enough? People think pressure begins in stadiums. It doesn't. Pressure begins in private. In the moments where nobody is watching. I felt pressure every morning I woke up. Because I knew Barcelona was investing in me. Not just as a footballer. As a medical risk. And risks can be abandoned. That fear stayed with me constantly. One bad performance. One injury. One disappointment. Would they stop believing? Would everything collapse? When you come from uncertainty, security never fully enters your mind. Even success feels temporary. There were days I struggled emotionally. Days I felt invisible. Days I doubted myself. But then training began. And suddenly the world made sense again. Because football became the only place where I did not need translation. The ball understood me immediately. No matter the country. No matter the pressure. no matter the fear. And slowly, something started happening. Players noticed. Coaches noticed. Not because I spoke loudly, but because my feet did. La Masia was not just an academy. It was a machine built to create greatness. Discipline, structure, competition, perfection. And inside that environment, weakness gets exposed quickly. I was still physically smaller than many others. But I learned something important there. Football intelligence could defeat physical power. I began moving differently, thinking faster, seeing spaces before they existed. I wasn't dominating through strength. I was surviving through imagination. And survival sharpens talent. There's a difference between being present and being recognized. For a long time, I was simply another young player trying to survive the system. Then came performances people could not ignore. Goals, dribbles, movement, control. Suddenly coaches stopped looking at my height first. Now they watched what happened after the ball touched my feet. And for the first time in years, I felt possibility becoming real. Not guaranteed, but real. But improvement came with sacrifice. While other teenagers explored freedom, I lived inside repetition, training, recovery, pressure, expectation. Football stopped being part of life. It became life itself. There were moments where I barely knew who I was outside the game, because every part of my identity had attached itself to one goal. Make the sacrifice worth it. Make the pain worth it. Make the move worth it. I was never the loudest person. Never the biggest voice in the room. People often misunderstand silence. They think it means weakness. But sometimes silence is survival. I carried emotions internally. Fear internally. Pressure internally. And when you carry everything inside long enough, you begin to fight battles nobody else can see. At some point, my struggle changed shape. I was no longer simply trying to survive football. Now football itself was beginning to bend around me. Defenders could not predict me, because I moved from instinct, from rhythm, from something deeper than calculation. The same body people once doubted was becoming impossible to stop. And there is something poetic about that. The thing the world saw as weakness became the reason I learned mastery differently from everyone else. Not physically, emotionally. Because pressure transforms people slowly. The innocent child chasing a ball in Rosario was becoming someone else. Someone more focused, more isolated, more driven. A boy becoming a professional before fully becoming a man. And success often demands pieces of you before it gives anything back. I had crossed oceans, endured treatment, fought loneliness, survived doubt. And now, for the first time, the world was beginning to notice me. But recognition is dangerous. Because once people see greatness in you, they stop asking whether you can survive, and start asking whether you can become legendary. The next stage of my life would not just test my talent, it would test my soul. By the time the world started learning my name, I had already lived through years of fear. Fear of not growing. Fear of not belonging. Fear of becoming the sacrifice that failed. But football was changing around me now. What once looked impossible was becoming inevitable. And inevitability is dangerous. Because once the world expects greatness from you, you no longer play only for joy. You play beneath the weight of expectation. Walking into Barcelona's first team felt unreal. Legends everywhere. Men I had watched from a distance. Now beside me. Training with them. Learning from them. Trying not to look overwhelmed. I was still quiet. Still reserved. Still carrying the same insecurities from childhood. Because success does not automatically erase fear. Sometimes it only hides it better. Then there was Ronaldinho. Some people change your career. Others change your spirit. Ronaldinho brought joy into football like music. He smiled when others panicked. Played when others calculated. And for a young player drowning in pressure, That mattered more than people understood. He welcomed me, protected me, believed in me before the world fully did. There are moments in life where one person's belief becomes a bridge between doubt and destiny. For me, he was one of those bridges. I still remember the feeling, the noise, the release. My first goal for Barcelona's senior team. Not just a goal. Proof. Proof that the child from Rosario belonged on this stage. Proof that the injections, sacrifices, loneliness, and uncertainty had not been meaningless. And when the ball crossed the line, something inside me changed forever. Because dreams stop being imagination the moment reality touches them. Success grows fast when the world is hungry for a story. And suddenly, I was everywhere. Highlights, headlines, comparisons, predictions. People spoke about my future like it already belonged to them. But fame is strange. The world sees celebration. The individual feels pressure. Because every brilliant performance creates a new expectation. And expectations never stop growing. I was no longer just Lionel Messi. Now I represented hope. For Barcelona fans. For Argentina. For every child told they were too small, too weak, too different. People projected dreams onto me. And while that is beautiful, it is also heavy. Because symbols are not allowed to break publicly. Then came Cristiano Ronaldo. Football transformed into something global. A rivalry. A comparison. A constant debate. Two players. Two styles. Two obsessions chasing greatness from different directions. People wanted conflict. But what they did not understand was this. Great rivals force evolution. His ambition pushed me. My consistency pushed him. And together, we entered a level of football history that almost stopped feeling human. Every season became more. Goals. Records. Champions League nights. Pressure beyond imagination. The world watched us like gladiators. But behind every statistic were sacrifices nobody could measure. People see trophies. They rarely see exhaustion. They see victories. They rarely see isolation. At the highest level, your life stops belonging entirely to you. Every movement becomes public. Every mistake becomes global. Every injury becomes news. And injuries terrified me. Because somewhere deep inside me still lived the child afraid his body would fail him again. No matter how successful I became. That fear never completely disappeared. Barcelona gave me glory. Argentina gave me pain. Representing my country meant carrying emotional weight impossible to describe. People expected miracles. Not performances. Miracles. And when we lost finals, the criticism became personal. Cruel. Relentless. I was accused of not loving my country enough. Not caring enough. Not being enough. And that hurt more deeply than people realized. Because Argentina was never just a jersey to me. It was home. Childhood. Memory. Identity. To disappoint your nation feels different from disappointing a club. It feels like failing part of yourself. There was a moment I broke internally. After another painful final loss with Argentina, I stepped away from international football. Not because I hated the game. Because I was emotionally exhausted. Years of pressure had piled up inside me silently. And silence eventually collapses under enough weight. People saw headlines. But they did not see the human being underneath them. A man tired of carrying expectation like punishment. A man wondering if greatness would ever feel peaceful. But some things pull you back no matter how far you walk away. Argentina was one of those things. I returned because love does not disappear simply because pain exists. And slowly, painfully, we kept fighting. Failure after failure. Heartbreak after heartbreak. Near victory after near victory. Sometimes destiny delays things not to deny them, but to deepen their meaning. Every footballer dreams of the World Cup. But for me, it became something larger. It became unfinished destiny. People measured my entire career against one missing trophy. as if greatness could only be validated by a single achievement. And yet, deep down, I wanted it too. Not for comparison, not for debate, but because little boys from Rosario still live inside grown men, and mine still dreamed. Then came the moment the world had waited for. The World Cup. Pressure beyond language. Emotion beyond control. Every match felt like history breathing against my neck. And when we finally won, it did not feel like triumph alone. It felt like release. Years of criticism. Years of doubt. Years of carrying expectation. Finally dissolving into one moment. People saw celebration. I felt peace. Sometimes I think about that child again. The small boy needing injections. The boy uncertain whether his body would allow his dreams to survive. The boy quietly fighting fear while pretending to be brave. If I could speak to him now, I would not tell him he becomes famous, or rich, or legendary. I would tell him this: they were wrong about your limits, because the greatest battle of my life was never against defenders. It was against the belief that I was too small to belong in history. People will debate records forever. Goals, awards, statistics, comparisons. But legacy is not numbers. Legacy is what people feel when they say your name. And if my story means anything, I hope it reminds people that weakness does not always remain weakness. Sometimes the very thing the world doubts becomes the thing that changes the world. I was not built like a giant. I was not designed to dominate physically. I was a fragile child with a dangerous dream. And somehow, that was enough. Some legends are born powerful. Others become powerful because life gave them no other choice.
I was not born into greatness. I was born into struggle. Into a world that did not promise me tomorrow, only survival for today. My name is Wilma Rudolph. And before the world ever called me a champion, it called me sick. Weak. Broken. A child who would never walk properly again. But what the world did not understand was simple. I was not finished. Not even close. I came into this world on June 23, 1940, in a small town in Tennessee, United States. Clarksville. A place where dreams were not handed out freely, especially not to a black girl born into poverty in the segregated South. I was the 20th of 22 children. Yes, 22. My mother worked as a maid. My father worked as a laborer. Life was not gentle in our home. It was crowded, loud, and often filled with struggle just to eat, just to survive another week. But even in that chaos, there was love. Not perfect love. Not easy love. But real love. And that love would become the first foundation of my survival. Because before I ever ran, I had to learn how to live. When I was a child, my body began to fail me. At first, it was just sickness. A fever. Weakness. Pain in my legs. Then everything changed. Polio. A word I would not fully understand at first, but one that would try to define the rest of my life. Polio did not just attack my body. It took my movement. It took my independence. It took my childhood. My left leg became twisted. My right leg grew weak. I could not walk without braces. Sometimes I could not walk at all. Other children ran outside to play. I watched from inside. Other children laughed in motion. I learned silence in stillness. Doctors told my mother I might never walk normally again. And in that moment, my future was written by someone who did not even know me. Or so they thought. My mother refused to accept it. She did not accept defeat. She did not accept limits. She refused the idea that her daughter would be defined by a sickness. So she searched. And searched. And searched again. For treatment. For hope. For anything that could give me a chance. We traveled long distances to hospitals meant for black patients, because in America at that time, even healthcare was separated by race. I received treatments that were painful. Massage therapy. Physical therapy. Long hours of stretching my legs when I cried from the pain. But my mother stayed beside me. She never left. Even when I wanted to quit. Even when I begged her to stop. She would whisper only one thing. You are going to walk again. Not, maybe. Not, we will see. But you are going to walk again. And slowly, something began to change. At around age 11, I did something that changed everything. I stood. Without braces. Without support. I walked. It was not fast. It was not perfect. But it was mine. And for the first time in my life, I felt something that polio had tried to take away forever. Freedom. But walking was not the end. It was the beginning. Because I was still not strong. Still not fast. Still not normal in the eyes of many. I was a girl who had to fight for every step. But something inside me had changed. I was no longer afraid of my body. I was learning to trust it again. And that trust would become something the world would one day call speed. In school, I discovered basketball. Not because I was looking for greatness. But because I was looking for belonging. At first, I was not good. I was slow. Unsteady. I missed shots. I struggled to keep up. But I did not stop. Because I already knew what it meant to lose movement. And I refused to lose again. Each practice became a battle against my past. Every sprint down the court was a message to my childhood illness. You did not win. Every fall was a reminder that I was still learning. Every bruise was proof that I was trying. And slowly, something incredible began to happen. I became faster. Stronger. More confident. Coaches started to notice me. Not because I was the best. But because I refused to quit. And in that refusal, something rare was forming. A competitor. But life was still not easy. I was still a black girl in the segregated South. Opportunities were limited. Doors were closed before I even reached them. But I kept moving. Because I had already learned something most people never understand. You do not need permission to survive. One day, during a basketball game, I was seen by someone who would change my life. A track coach named Ed Temple from Tennessee State University. He saw something in me that I did not yet see in myself. Speed. Not just physical speed. But something deeper. A hunger to move forward no matter what was in my way. He invited me to train. Track and field. Sprinting. Running. The very thing my body was once told it might never fully do. I did not say yes immediately. Because running felt impossible. Not because I was afraid of failure. But because I had once been told my body was not built for it. But something inside me whispered. What if they were wrong? The first time I trained seriously on the track, I did not feel like an athlete. I felt like a survivor trying to prove she deserved to be there. My legs burned. My lungs fought for air. Other girls were faster. Cleaner. More experienced. But I kept showing up. Because I had already survived worse than exhaustion. I had survived being told I might never walk. And now I was being told I might never win. But I had learned something important. Words do not define limits. Persistence does. Day after day, I trained. Morning runs. Afternoon drills. Evening exhaustion. Again and again. Again and again. Again and again. Until something started to shift. My body stopped resisting me. And started responding. My stride became smoother. My speed became sharper. My confidence became louder. And without realizing it, I was transforming. From a girl who survived polio into a girl who was beginning to outrun her past. But the world had not seen anything yet. Because my story was not about becoming average. It was about becoming impossible. And that is where everything begins to change. Not with victory. Not with medals. But with a decision. To keep running, even when the world never expected you to move again. I trained harder than ever. Not because I wanted applause. But because I feared becoming temporary. I feared becoming a headline people forgot. I feared proving the doubters right after all. So I pushed myself relentlessly. Practice after practice. Race after race. Trying to outrun not only competitors, but insecurity itself. By this point, my speed had become extraordinary. I began dominating races. Winning consistently. Breaking records. Crowds gathered to watch me run. And reporters started giving me names. The fastest girl in the world. At first, hearing that frightened me. Because titles create pressure. Once the world labels you extraordinary, you feel terrified of appearing ordinary again. But underneath all the attention, I was still human. Still emotional. Still vulnerable. Still carrying memories of weakness inside a body now praised for strength. And there were nights I sat alone wondering, who am I without winning? That question haunted me. Because athletes often become trapped inside performance. People cheer for what you do. Not always for who you are. And I worried constantly that if I stopped winning, love and admiration would disappear too. Yet every race taught me something deeper. Running was never just about speed. It was about freedom. Every time my feet touched the track, I remembered the child who once could barely walk. And suddenly every sprint became emotional. Not because I was chasing medals, but because movement itself felt sacred to me. A miracle repeated over and over again. The closer I moved toward adulthood, the more intense my ambition became. Not just to compete. Not just to win. But to become undeniable. I wanted to reach a level where nobody could question whether I belonged. Not because I needed approval, but because I understood what representation meant. A poor black girl from Tennessee. A former polio patient. Standing above the world's greatest athletes. That mattered. Not only for me, but for every child who had ever been underestimated. And then came the next great target. Rome. The Olympics that would change my life forever. The Olympics where the world would stop seeing me as a survivor. And start seeing me as a legend. But before legends are created, they are tested. And my greatest test was still coming. People think transformation happens in one moment. One victory. One speech. One miracle. But they are wrong. Transformation is repetition. Pain repeated. Failure repeated. Discipline repeated. Hope repeated until it becomes identity. And by the time I entered my teenage years, running was no longer just something I did. It was becoming who I was. Every morning before the sun fully rose, I trained. The air in Tennessee carried heat that stuck to your skin, but I welcomed it. Pain no longer frightened me the way it once had. I had already lived through worse. The braces. The hospitals. The silence of being left behind while other children played. Compared to that, exhaustion was nothing. So I ran. Again. And again. And again. Coach Ed Temple was not soft on us. He did not care about excuses. He cared about discipline. Precision. Mental toughness. Many people only saw medals when they looked at athletes. Coach Temple saw responsibility. He believed talent without discipline was dangerous. And he pushed us harder than anyone else ever had. Some girls hated it. Some quit. Some cried after practice. But he understood something before the rest of the world did. Black girls from poor communities would need more than talent to survive America. We would need excellence so undeniable it could not be ignored. At Tennessee State's summer training program, I was surrounded by athletes who seemed stronger than me, faster than me, better than me. And insecurity returned like an old ghost. I remembered the girl in leg braces. The girl who struggled to walk. The girl doctors doubted. Sometimes that version of me still lived inside my mind. Even while I ran. Especially while I ran. Because trauma does not disappear simply because your circumstances improve. Sometimes your body moves forward while your mind stays trapped years behind. I remember standing beside other runners before races and wondering if I truly belonged there. I smiled on the outside. But internally, fear whispered constantly. What if your body fails again? What if this is temporary? What if everyone discovers you were never supposed to make it this far? That fear became my invisible opponent. Not the girls beside me. Not the stopwatch. Not the track. My real battle was against the voice telling me I was still broken. But there was another voice growing louder. A quieter one. A stronger one. It said, "You already survived impossible things." And slowly, I began believing it. The more I trained, the more victories started coming. Small races became bigger races. Local attention became national attention. People started talking about the fast girl from Tennessee. They spoke about my speed with excitement. But they did not know the history inside my legs. They saw movement. Not the years of immobility before it. They saw victories. Not the suffering that built them. And maybe that is the strange thing about greatness. People admire the result, but rarely survive the process required to create it. At 16 years old, my life changed forever. I qualified for the 1956 Olympic Games in Melbourne, Australia. 16. Still young. Still uncertain. Still carrying the insecurities of a girl who once wore leg braces. And suddenly I was preparing to represent the United States on the biggest athletic stage in the world. It felt unreal. Like I was watching someone else's life happen. Traveling to Australia was my first experience seeing how large the world truly was. The crowds. The noise. The athletes from different countries. Different languages. Different cultures. It overwhelmed me. I was no longer just competing in Tennessee. Now I was standing beside the greatest athletes on earth. And fear returned again. Because greatness can inspire you. Or intimidate you. Sometimes both at the same time. I remember looking around Olympic Village thinking, what am I doing here? Not because I lacked talent. But because deep inside, part of me still saw myself as the sick little girl from Clarksville. Trauma has a strange way of shrinking your self-image, even while your life expands. And for a moment, I doubted myself. But Coach Temple refused to let us think small. He constantly reminded us that we belonged there. Not because someone gave us charity, but because we earned it. That mattered deeply. Especially as black athletes in 1950s America. Because outside the stadium, racism still waited for us. Segregation still existed. Discrimination still followed us. We represented a country abroad that often denied us equality at home. And that contradiction weighed heavily on many of us. We wore the American uniform proudly, while knowing America itself still struggled to fully see our humanity. At the Olympics, I competed in the relay. The pressure was enormous. One mistake could cost the team everything. Every exchange mattered. Every second mattered. Every breath mattered. And when the race began, instinct took over. The crowd became noise. The fear disappeared. My body moved automatically. Years of training. Years of struggle. Years of pain. All of it exploded into motion. And when we crossed the finish line, we won bronze. An Olympic medal. At 16 years old. People celebrated. Newspapers praised us. The world finally noticed my name. But internally, something even more important had happened. For the first time, I truly believed my future could become bigger than my past. That belief changed everything. Because once a person begins to believe they are capable of more, they become dangerous to limitation. Returning home after the Olympics felt strange. I was celebrated publicly. But life itself had not magically changed. Racism still existed. Poverty still existed. The South was still segregated. And fame did not erase reality. Sometimes people imagine success protects you from pain. It does not. It simply changes the kind of pain you experience. I returned to school with new expectations surrounding me. Now people expected victories. Expected speed. Expected greatness. And expectations can become another kind of pressure. Because suddenly losing feels bigger. Failure feels more public. And fear grows louder. I trained harder than ever. Not because I wanted applause. But because I feared becoming temporary. I feared becoming a headline people forgot. I feared proving the doubters right after all. So I pushed myself relentlessly. Practice after practice. Race after race. Trying to outrun not only competitors, but insecurity itself. By this point, my speed had become extraordinary. I began dominating races. Winning consistently. Breaking records. Crowds gathered to watch me run. And reporters started giving me names. The fastest girl in the world. At first, hearing that frightened me. Because titles create pressure. Once the world labels you extraordinary, you feel terrified of appearing ordinary again. But underneath all the attention, I was still human. Still emotional. Still vulnerable. Still carrying memories of weakness inside a body now praised for strength. And there were nights I sat alone wondering, who am I without winning? That question haunted me. Because athletes often become trapped inside performance. People cheer for what you do. Not always for who you are. And I worried constantly that if I stopped winning, love and admiration would disappear too. Yet every race taught me something deeper. Running was never just about speed. It was about freedom. Every time my feet touched the track, I remembered the child who once could barely walk. And suddenly every sprint became emotional. Not because I was chasing medals, but because movement itself felt sacred to me. A miracle repeated over and over again. The closer I moved toward adulthood, the more intense my ambition became. Not just to compete. Not just to win. But to become undeniable. I wanted to reach a level where nobody could question whether I belonged. Not because I needed approval, but because I understood what representation meant. A poor black girl from Tennessee. A former polio patient. Standing above the world's greatest athletes. That mattered. Not only for me, but for every child who had ever been underestimated. And then came the next great target. Rome. The Olympics that would change my life forever. The Olympics where the world would stop seeing me as a survivor. And start seeing me as a legend. But before legends are created, they are tested. And my greatest test was still coming. By 1960, the world had begun to notice me. But noticing someone, and understanding them, are two very different things. People saw speed. They saw medals. They saw headlines. But they did not see the pressure building inside me. Because once people start calling you extraordinary, you become trapped between two fears. The fear of failure. And the fear of never being enough again. Rome. 1960 Olympic Games. The city felt alive before the races even began. Crowds flooded the streets. Athletes carried the hopes of entire nations on their shoulders. Cameras followed every movement. Journalists searched constantly for stories powerful enough to inspire the world. And somehow, I became one of them. But internally, I still carried the same question. What if I lose? Not because losing was shameful, but because I understood how quickly the world can stop celebrating you. Fame is loud when you are winning. Silence becomes louder when you are not. Training before the Olympics had pushed my body to its limit. My muscles constantly burned. My legs ached. There were days exhaustion sat deep inside my bones. But I hid it well. Athletes learn early how to perform strength even when they feel weak. Especially women. Especially black women. Especially black women in the 1960s. Because vulnerability was rarely treated kindly by the world around us. So I smiled. Even when I was afraid. Even when I doubted myself. Even when the pressure felt unbearable. By then, reporters had already started building expectations around me. The fastest woman alive. The queen of sprinting. Titles like that sound glamorous from the outside. But inside your mind, they become weight. Because every race becomes a defense of your identity. You stop asking, can I win? And start asking, what happens if I don't? The first event approached. The 100 meters. One of the shortest races in athletics. A race decided in seconds. Sometimes less. Years of sacrifice reduced to a brief explosion of movement. And before the starting gun, time slows down. People think athletes hear the crowd. But often, we hear ourselves. Our fears. Our memories. Our heartbeat. I remember crouching at the starting line and thinking about my childhood. The hospitals. The braces. The pain. The little girl who once struggled simply to stand. And suddenly I realized something. No matter what happened next, I had already defeated impossible odds. That realization calmed me. The gun fired. And instinct took over. My body launched forward. Every stride felt automatic. The track blurred beneath my feet. The world disappeared. There was no crowd. No cameras. No pressure. Only movement. Pure movement. And when I crossed the finish line, I won gold. Olympic gold. The first one. The stadium erupted. Reporters rushed toward me. Photographers captured every angle they could. But emotionally, the moment felt strangely quiet inside me. Not because I wasn't happy, but because the victory felt deeper than celebration. It felt personal. Like I had finally answered every doctor who once doubted me. Every limitation. Every prediction about my body. But the Olympics were not over. And neither was the pressure. Because once you win once, people expect you to keep winning forever. Next came the 200 meters. Longer. More demanding. A race requiring not only speed, but endurance. And by then, everyone was watching me. Every movement became a headline. Every expression became analysis. The world wanted certainty from me. But inside, I was exhausted. Physically. Emotionally. Mentally. Success can drain you in ways failure never does. Because when you are losing, people leave you alone. When you are winning, everyone wants a piece of you. Still, I ran. Because that was what I knew how to do. The gun fired again. And once more, I exploded down the track. Curve. Stride. Breath. Acceleration. The rhythm felt almost spiritual. As if my body remembered every painful mile that brought me there. And again. Gold. Second Olympic gold medal. The fastest woman in the world. Now officially. Undeniably. Historically. But history has a strange habit. It celebrates achievement while ignoring the emotional cost behind it. People saw confidence in me. But confidence and pressure often live side by side. Because by then I understood something dangerous. The world loved me most when I was winning. And that realization creates fear. Fear that if you stop succeeding, you stop mattering. The relay race became my final challenge. The 4x100 meters relay. A team event. No room for mistakes. And during the race, disaster nearly struck. A baton exchange went wrong. For a split second, everything almost collapsed. One mistake could destroy the race. Destroy the dream. Destroy the image people had built around me. But panic sharpens some people. And in that moment, instinct saved us. We recovered. We accelerated. We fought. And we crossed the finish line first. 3rd gold medal. 3 gold medals in a single Olympics. A black woman from segregated Tennessee. A former polio patient. Now standing above the world. The world exploded with attention. Suddenly my face appeared everywhere. Magazines. Newspapers. Television. People called me graceful. Elegant. Untouchable. An icon. And while the world celebrated me, I quietly struggled to understand who I was becoming. Because fame changes the way people see you. But it also changes the way you see yourself. When I returned home, celebrations were planned in my honor. Parades. Events. Ceremonies. But there was a problem. The celebration was going to be segregated. Black people and white people separated. Again. Even after I represented America. Even after winning gold for America. Even after becoming a symbol of national pride. Segregation still followed me home. And this time, I refused to accept it. I said one thing clearly. If the event is segregated, I won't attend. That decision mattered deeply. Because fame gives people visibility. And visibility creates responsibility. Eventually, the celebration became integrated. One of the first integrated public events in Clarksville, Tennessee. That moment meant more to me than many people realized. Because my victories were never only about athletics. They were about dignity. About possibility. About forcing the world to see humanity where it once refused to look. But while the public saw triumph, privately, life remained complicated. Fame brought attention from everywhere. People constantly wanted interviews. Appearances. Smiles. Perfection. And slowly, exhaustion began building inside me. Not physical exhaustion. Soul exhaustion. The kind that comes from constantly performing strength for the world. I was still young. Still trying to understand myself. Still trying to build a personal life while living under public scrutiny. And sometimes I missed simplicity. The quiet days before cameras. Before expectations. Before the world attached my worth to victory. Because fame often gives you admiration, while quietly stealing your privacy. Yet through all of it, I never forgot the child I used to be. The girl staring out windows while other children played. The girl fighting braces. The girl doctors doubted. She stayed with me. And maybe that is why success never fully changed me. Because deep inside, I knew exactly how fragile life could become. People started calling me inspirational. A symbol. A hero. But I never felt superhuman. I felt human. A woman who suffered. A woman who feared. A woman who kept moving anyway. And maybe that is what real strength actually is. Not the absence of fear, but movement despite it. By the early 1960s, My name had become global. But the next challenge in my life would not come from a track. It would come from something much harder to outrun. Pressure. Identity. Womanhood. Public expectation. And the painful realization that medals do not protect you from ordinary human struggles. Because after the cheering fades, you still have to live with yourself. People think the hardest part of success is reaching the top. It is not. The hardest part is discovering who you are after you arrive there. Because eventually the races end. The crowds disappear. The cameras leave. And then one question remains in the silence. Who am I without applause? After Rome, my life changed completely. Everywhere I went, people recognized me. Children stared at me with admiration. Reporters followed me with questions. Strangers treated me like I belonged to the world. And maybe in some ways, I did. Because once society turns you into a symbol, your life no longer feels entirely yours. I tried to enjoy the fame. I tried to embrace the opportunities. But attention comes with pressure. Constant pressure. Pressure to remain inspiring. Pressure to remain beautiful. Pressure to remain successful. Pressure to remain perfect. Especially as a woman. Especially as a black woman in America during the 1960s. The world celebrated us publicly while still limiting us privately. People loved watching us win. But many still resisted giving us equal treatment once the race was over. At events and interviews, reporters often focused on my appearance as much as my athletic achievements. They described my legs, my smile, my elegance. Sometimes it felt like the world wanted me to be graceful more than powerful, beautiful more than human. And that kind of attention creates conflict inside a person. Because eventually you begin wondering, do they admire me, or the image they created of me? I was still very young. And fame arrived before I fully understood myself. That is dangerous. Because when identity is still forming, public attention can distort it. You start performing versions of yourself that make other people comfortable. And slowly, the real you becomes harder to hear. I retired from track earlier than many expected. Some people were shocked. Others thought I was wasting my potential. But few understood the emotional exhaustion living inside me. Running had given me freedom. But it had also consumed my identity. I wanted to experience life beyond the track. To discover who Wilma Rudolph was without starting blocks and finish lines. But retirement brought its own emotional battles. Because athletes spend years chasing structure, training schedules, competition, goals, movement. And when that suddenly disappears, silence enters your life differently. The body rests. But the mind becomes restless. For years, my purpose had been clear. Run faster. Win races. Represent greatness. Now suddenly there was uncertainty. No crowds waiting. No medals ahead. Only ordinary life. And ordinary life can feel terrifying after extraordinary success. I became a wife. A mother. A public figure navigating adulthood while carrying the emotional weight of global fame. Motherhood changed me deeply. It grounded me in ways victory never could. Because children do not care about Olympic medals the way the world does. They care whether you are present. Whether you listen. Whether you love them. And that reminded me of something important. Human connection matters more than achievement. Still, balancing everything became difficult. Relationships struggled under public pressure. Fame affects not only the person experiencing it, but everyone around them. Privacy disappears. Expectations grow. And sometimes people stop seeing the individual beneath the reputation. There were moments loneliness crept into my life unexpectedly. Even surrounded by people. Even admired by millions. Because admiration and understanding are not the same thing. People knew my story. But very few knew my inner world. Very few understood the emotional scars left behind by years of pressure. Years of proving myself. Years of feeling responsible for inspiring others while privately trying to hold myself together. And yet, I continued forward. Because survival had already become part of my nature. As the civil rights movement grew stronger across America, I became increasingly aware that my success carried meaning beyond sports. The country itself was changing. People marched for equality. For dignity. For justice. Black Americans were demanding visibility in a nation built on systems designed to erase them. And athletes were becoming symbols whether they wanted to or not. I understood what it meant for young black girls to see me succeed. Not because I was perfect. But because representation changes imagination. When people see someone who looks like them overcoming impossible odds, something shifts psychologically. Possibility expands. Limits begin to crack. And I wanted children, especially black children, to understand something clearly. Your beginning does not decide your ending. So I began speaking more. Working with youth. Encouraging students. Sharing my experiences openly. Not only the victories. But the struggles too. Because inspiration without honesty becomes performance. And I never wanted my story to feel fake. People often asked me how I stayed strong. The truth is, there were days I did not feel strong at all. Days I doubted myself. Days I felt overwhelmed. Days I questioned whether all the pressure had been worth it. But strength is often misunderstood. People think strength means never struggling emotionally. No. Real strength means continuing despite emotional struggle. There were moments I reflected deeply on the little girl I once was. The child in leg braces. The child people doubted. And sometimes I wondered what she would think if she could see the future. Would she believe it? Would she understand that the pain she endured would one day inspire millions? Or would she simply feel relief knowing she survived? Maybe both. As years passed, my legacy continued growing. Schools invited me. Organizations honored me. Young athletes studied my races. The world kept repeating my achievements. 3 Olympic gold medals. Fastest woman alive. History maker. But privately, I hoped people understood something deeper than statistics. I hoped they understood resilience. Because my story was never really about running. Running was only the visible part. The real story was survival. A child surviving illness. A black woman surviving segregation. A human being surviving pressure, expectation, fear, and self-doubt. That was the true race. And unlike Olympic races, that race never truly ends. There is something strange about becoming inspirational to people. They often remember your victories, while forgetting your humanity. But I remained human through all of it. I made mistakes. I struggled emotionally. I felt fear. I felt uncertainty. I felt exhausted. And acknowledging that matters. Because too many people believe greatness belongs only to people without weakness. That is not true. Greatness often grows directly from weakness confronted honestly. The older I became, the more I realized legacy is not built only through achievement. It is built through impact. Through the lives you touch. The hope you leave behind. The doors your courage opens for others. And that understanding gave my life deeper meaning than medals ever could. Still, life would eventually bring another battle. Not on the track. Not in competition. But inside my own body once again. The same body that had already fought so hard to survive. And in the end, I would be forced to confront mortality the same way I once confronted fear. Face first. Because no matter how fast you run, time always keeps pace beside you. As I grew older, people continued telling my story. The little girl with polio. The woman who won Olympic gold. The fastest woman in the world. But life itself became quieter with time. And in quietness, reflection becomes unavoidable. You begin looking back at your life differently. Not as headlines. Not as achievements. But as moments. Moments of fear. Moments of courage. Moments when you almost gave up. But didn't. I spent many of my later years working with young people. Encouraging them. Teaching them. Trying to show them that adversity does not have to become identity. I especially cared about children who felt overlooked. Children who believed their circumstances defined their future. Because I knew that feeling personally. I had lived it. Whenever I spoke to young athletes, I tried to tell them something deeper than work hard. Because hard work alone is not the full truth. You also need resilience. Emotional endurance. The ability to survive disappointment without losing yourself. The ability to keep moving while uncertain. The ability to believe in possibility before evidence appears. That is what truly changes lives. People often ask me if I ever became angry about my childhood. About polio. About segregation. About poverty. The truth is, pain changes people differently. Some people become bitter. Others become determined. I chose determination because bitterness would have trapped me in the past forever. And I had already spent too much of my childhood trapped. Still, trauma leaves marks. Even when success arrives. Even when applause fills stadiums. Even when the world calls you inspirational. There are certain emotional wounds that never disappear completely. You simply learn how to carry them differently. And maybe that is part of being human. As decades passed, sports itself changed. New athletes emerged. New records were broken. New generations rose. That is the nature of time. No champion stays at the center forever. But I learned something beautiful about legacy. You do not need to remain current to remain important. Because influence travels through people. Through inspiration. Through memory. Through courage repeated by someone else years later. Young women in sports began receiving opportunities that barely existed when I was young. Black athletes gained greater visibility across the world. The barriers that once felt immovable slowly began cracking. Not disappearing completely. But changing. And knowing I had played even a small role in that transformation brought me peace. Yet life has a way of bringing us back to vulnerability. No matter how powerful we once appeared. No matter how celebrated we became. Eventually the body reminds us that we are temporary. And in the 1990s, my health began declining. Cancer. A word heavy enough to silence rooms. Heavy enough to force reflection. Heavy enough to make even the strongest people confront fear again. I had spent my life outrunning obstacles. Outrunning expectations. Outrunning pain. But illness is different. You cannot sprint away from it. You must face it slowly. Honestly. One day at a time. There were moments during my illness when I reflected deeply on my life. Not only the victories, but the meaning behind them. I thought about my mother. Her faith. Her refusal to accept limitation. Without her, perhaps none of this happens. I thought about the doctors who doubted me. The coaches who challenged me. The crowds who cheered me. The children who found hope in my story. And I realized something important. No life is built alone. Every triumph carries invisible hands behind it. As my strength faded, I also understood something else. The world had spent years calling me fast. But speed was never my greatest achievement. Survival was. Because surviving emotionally. Surviving psychologically. Surviving spiritually. That is harder than running. Near the end of my life, I was no longer thinking about records. Not really. Records are eventually broken. Statistics eventually fade. But impact remains alive inside people. And if my life proved anything, I hoped it proved this. Human beings are more powerful than the limits placed upon them. I passed away on November 12, 1994. Only 54 years old. Too young in many ways. But a life is not measured only by length. It is measured by depth. By influence. By the courage it leaves behind for others to borrow. And even after death, stories continue moving. Mine did too. Today, people still speak my name. Wilma Rudolph. Not because I was perfect. Not because I never struggled. But because I kept moving forward when stopping would have been easier. And maybe that is what inspires people most. Not perfection. Persistence. Somewhere right now, there is a child being underestimated. A child being told they are too weak. Too poor. Too damaged. Too different. Too late. And maybe they will hear my story one day. Maybe they will discover that a little girl once wore leg braces. And later outran the world. Maybe they will realize limitation is not always truth. Sometimes limitation is simply someone else's imagination speaking too loudly. If I could speak directly to that child now, I would say this. Your beginning is not your destiny. Pain is not proof that your future is over. Fear is not evidence that you cannot succeed. And weakness today does not mean weakness forever. Keep going. Keep fighting. Keep moving. Even slowly. Especially slowly. Because movement itself is victory when life once tried to hold you still. I was never supposed to become an Olympic champion. That is what made it matter. I was never supposed to run. That is what made every step powerful. And I was never supposed to inspire generations. That happened simply because I refused to surrender. The world remembers the medals. But I hope history remembers something deeper. A human being who faced impossible odds. And kept moving anyway. Ending cinematic narration. She was born into poverty. Struck by illness. Told she might never walk again. But she became one of the fastest women in human history. Not because life became easy. But because she refused to let suffering become the end of her story. This was not just the story of speed. It was the story of resilience. Of survival. Of a woman who turned pain into motion. And motion into legacy. JANICEFBAPS Studios Productions. Where pain becomes powerful stories. Some stories entertain you. But stories like this change you. Wilma Rudolph was told she might never walk again. Yet she outran history itself. And maybe that is the reminder all of us need. Your current struggle is not your final identity. If this story moved you. If it inspired you. If it reminded you to keep fighting no matter how impossible life feels. Then subscribe to this journey. Because here at JANICEFBAPS Studios Productions, we do not just tell stories. We uncover survival. We uncover pain transformed into purpose. We uncover the human spirit at its breaking point, and the courage that rises afterward. Like this video. Share it with someone who feels like giving up. And comment below. What obstacle did you overcome that once felt impossible? Your story might become hope for someone else. More powerful true stories. More cinematic documentaries. More unforgettable journeys. Only here. At JANICEFBAPS Studios Productions. Where pain becomes powerful stories.
My name is Cristiano Ronaldo dos Santos Aveiro. Before the stadiums, before the lights, before the trophies, there was only one thing I knew: struggle. I was born in Madeira, Portugal. A small island, beautiful to tourists, but not kind to children like me who came from nothing. People see the finished version of me today. They see the goals, the records, the fame. But they never saw the hunger that built me. Not the hunger for fame. the hunger for survival. Because when you grow up poor, you don't dream for fun. You dream because reality is too heavy to carry. I was one of those children. We were not a rich family. Not even close. My father worked as a kitman at a football club. My mother was a cook and cleaner. My home was small, often noisy with stress, arguments, and worry about money that was never enough. I shared a room with my siblings. Sometimes there wasn't enough food. Sometimes my mother cried quietly so we wouldn't hear her. But we always heard her. Because silence in poverty is still loud. I remember nights when I would go to bed hungry and still dream of football. Not because it was escape, but because it was the only place I felt free. We didn't have luxury. We had hope. And hope, in a poor house, is both a blessing and a burden. Football became my language before I even understood life. I didn't have toys. I had a ball. I didn't have comfort. I had the street. I didn't have guidance. I had instinct. I would play anywhere, on concrete, on broken fields, on narrow streets where cars almost hit us. It didn't matter. Every kick was a message. I am still here. I still exist. I still matter. But even then, I was different. Not the strongest. Not the tallest. Not the most talented at first glance. But I was obsessed. When other kids went home, I stayed. When they rested, I repeated. When they laughed, I trained. People thought I was crazy. But I knew something they didn't know yet. I was building something that pain could not destroy. At 12 years old, I left my family. That is a pain I cannot explain fully even today. Imagine being a child and leaving everything you know, your mother, your siblings, your home, your comfort, just for a dream that might never come true. I moved to Lisbon to join Sporting. I was alone. No family around me. No familiar voice at night. No comfort when I felt scared. Just pressure. Just expectations. Just survival. I cried many nights. Not because I was weak, but because I was still a child carrying adult pain. Sometimes I wanted to go back home. But I couldn't. Because I knew if I went back, I might never return again. So I stayed, even when it hurt. At Sporting, I faced something worse than poverty. Rejection. There were coaches who doubted me. Players who mocked my accent. People who said I was too thin, too emotional, too selfish with the ball. They said I would not make it. And I stored every word. Not as hatred, but as fuel. Because when people doubt you long enough, you stop trying to convince them. You start trying to become undeniable. There were days I trained extra while others rested. Days I pushed my body until I felt pain in places I didn't know existed. Days I collapsed from exhaustion. But I kept going. Because failure was not an option I could afford. Then came Manchester United. A moment that changed my life forever. I was young, nervous, hungry, and I knew this was my chance. The Premier League was not kind to young players. It was physical, fast, ruthless. But I was ready, or at least I believed I was. When I played against Manchester United, I showed something different. Not just skill, but fearlessness. I was not playing like someone who wanted success. I was playing like someone who needed it. After the match, everything changed. Sir Alex Ferguson saw something in me. He saw not just talent, he saw obsession. And he brought me to Manchester. At Manchester United, I learned something important. Talent gets you noticed. Hard work keeps you alive. But pressure can destroy you if you are not strong enough. Fans expected magic. Coaches expected discipline. Opponents expected mistakes. And the world expected perfection. But I was still learning. Still growing. Still becoming. There were moments I failed. Moments I was criticized heavily. Moments I felt alone even in a crowded stadium. But I never stopped. Because I understood something early. If you stop under pressure, pressure wins. People call me obsessed. And maybe I am. But they don't understand what created that obsession. It was not fame. It was fear. Fear of being average. Fear of returning to nothing. Fear of disappointment. So I trained more. I studied my body. My diet changed. My sleep changed. My mindset changed. I began to see football not as a game, but as a responsibility. Every match mattered. Every goal mattered. Every mistake mattered. Because I was no longer just playing for myself. I was playing for every version of me that suffered in silence. Behind success, there is always pain people don't see. I lost my father at a young age emotionally, even before physically accepting it. Alcohol destroyed parts of his life. That pain shaped me deeply. And later, I faced more personal losses, more emotional battles, moments of loneliness despite being surrounded by millions. Fame is strange. It gives you everything people want, but sometimes takes away what you need. Peace, privacy, normal life. There were nights I sat alone, thinking, is this worth it? But then I remembered the boy in Madeira, the boy with no shoes, the boy with hunger, and I knew I could not stop. When I joined Real Madrid, pressure multiplied. Now it was not just about playing well, it was about breaking history, breaking records, winning everything. I became a machine in the eyes of the world, but inside I was still human, still feeling, still fighting emotions no one saw. I trained harder than ever. I pushed my limits beyond comfort, because at that level, talent is not enough. Only discipline separates legends from players. And I wanted to be more than a player. I wanted to be history. Not everyone supported me. Some doubted my character. Some criticized my attitude. Some celebrated my failures more than my success. I learned something powerful. People will love you when you succeed, and question you when you dominate. So I stopped trying to please everyone. I focused on winning. Silence became my response. Goals became my language. At Juventus, I faced something different. Not just competition, but identity questions. Am I still the same player? Am I still needed? Can I still perform at the highest level? Every new environment tests you differently. But I adapted again, because adaptation is survival, and survival is my nature. Returning to Manchester United felt like a story coming full circle. But football does not care about stories. It cares about performance. Expectations were massive. Criticism even louder. And I had to face reality. Time changes everything. Bodies age. Teams evolve. Fans forget quickly. But I did not stop fighting, because I never learned how to quit. When I moved to Saudi Arabia, many called it the end. But they misunderstood. For me, it was not an ending. It was transformation. Football is not just Europe. Legacy is not just Europe. Greatness exists wherever you choose to perform. I continued to score, to train, to inspire, because my story was never about location. It was about mindset. People ask me, what did success cost you? I tell them the truth. It cost me childhood. It cost me privacy. It cost me normal life. It cost me peace at times, but it gave me something else. Purpose, discipline, legacy, and a name that will not disappear easily. When I look back, I don't see just trophies. I see struggle. I see sacrifice. I see pain. I see a boy who had every reason to quit, but didn't. That is the real story. Not perfection, not fame, but endurance. Because greatness is not built in comfort. It is built in hunger. And I was always hungry. Not for attention, but for meaning. Cristiano Ronaldo. And I was not born a legend. I became one through pain, through sacrifice, through discipline, through belief when nobody else believed. And if my story teaches anything, let it be this. You do not need perfect conditions to become great. You only need refusal to quit. Straight self-narration documentary script. People think pressure starts when the cameras arrive. They are wrong. Pressure starts the moment people begin expecting you to save them. By the time I became one of the biggest footballers in the world, my family no longer worried about food. But something else replaced that hunger. Responsibility. And responsibility can become heavier than poverty. Because now failure would not just hurt me. It would hurt everyone connected to me. Every match became more than football. Every performance became survival at another level. The world stopped seeing me as human.
E became a symbol. A machine.
A headline. People no longer asked if I was tired. They asked why I scored only once. They no longer asked if I was hurting. They asked why I didn't smile enough. Success changes how people see your pain. When you are poor, they pity you. When you are successful, they assume you no longer suffer. But pain evolves. It does not disappear. Then came the rivalry that changed everything. Me and Lionel Messi. The world turned football into war. Every goal compared. Every trophy analyzed. Every mistake magnified. People chose sides like religion. Some loved me. Some hated me. And honestly, sometimes I think people needed that rivalry more than we did. Because rivalry creates emotion. Emotion creates obsession. And obsession creates immortality. But behind the headlines, I felt the pressure deeply. Because when the world compares you every day, you stop playing freely. You start living under judgment. There is a loneliness that comes with greatness. Very few people talk about it. When you become successful, people surround you. But not everyone around you truly sees you. Some see opportunity. Some see money. Some see status. Very few see the exhausted human being underneath. I learned to protect myself emotionally, to trust carefully, to stay guarded, because fame attracts admiration, but also manipulation. People praised my physique, my speed, my athleticism, but maintaining that level for years is torture. Ice baths, strict diets, endless recovery, training when injured, playing through pain. The body keeps score of everything. There were mornings I woke up barely able to move, but I still trained, still smiled, still performed, because the world only celebrates results, not the suffering behind them. Athletes live with a silent fear, a fear ordinary people rarely understand, the fear that one day your body will stop obeying your mind. And when you build your identity around excellence, that fear becomes terrifying. I watched younger players arrive every year. Faster. Stronger. Hungrier. And I realized something difficult. Football never waits for anyone. Not even legends. So I worked harder. Not because I wanted attention. Because I was fighting time itself. Winning the European Championship with Portugal was different. That victory was emotional. Not because of trophies, but because of what it represented. For years people said Portugal depended too much on me, that I could not lead a nation to glory. And then came the final. I got injured early. I cried leaving the pitch. Not because of physical pain, but because I thought the dream was dying in front of me. Yet somehow, we won. And in that moment, I realized leadership is not always about scoring. Sometimes leadership is surviving emotionally while your team finishes the fight. The internet created another version of me. Perfect. Confident. Intouchable. But social media is a performance. A highlight reel. People never see the empty hotel rooms. The anxiety before games. The emotional exhaustion. The fear of disappointing millions. Fame teaches you how to smile while carrying invisible weight. And sometimes, after the cameras turned off, silence felt louder than stadiums. Becoming a father changed me. Suddenly success meant something deeper. It was no longer only about records. It became about legacy. About protection. About being the father I wished I could fully have emotionally growing up. Because pain can either destroy you, or teach you how to love differently. My children became grounding forces in a life filled with chaos. They reminded me that beyond football, I was still human. Still a man. Still a father. Success is strange. The higher you rise, the more people wait for you to fall. Criticism became constant. Pundits. Media. Former players. Online strangers. Everyone had opinions. And eventually I understood something powerful. If you listen to every voice, you lose your own. So I focused inward. Discipline became therapy. Training became meditation. Competition became escape. Perfection is dangerous. Because once people see you as perfect, they stop allowing you to be human. One bad game becomes disaster. One emotional reaction becomes scandal. One weakness becomes global discussion. I carried enormous pressure for years trying to maintain impossible standards. And the hardest part? Sometimes I placed even more pressure on myself than the world did. That is the curse of obsession. No victory ever feels fully enough. There are moments in life bigger than football. Moments where trophies become meaningless. Moments where grief enters your home and changes everything forever. And in those moments, you realize something terrifying. Fame cannot protect you from human pain. Money cannot stop heartbreak. Success cannot negotiate with loss. Those experiences changed me deeply. They reminded me that underneath the athlete, there is still a fragile human soul. People ask me why I continued pushing so hard after achieving everything. The answer is simple. Because I never forgot where I came from. I never forgot the small house, the hungry nights, the fear in my mother's eyes, the uncertainty. That child still exists inside me. And maybe that is why I keep going. Because part of me is still trying to prove that little boy mattered. Greatness is misunderstood. People think greatness is talent, or trophies, or fame. But real greatness is consistency under pressure. It is discipline when motivation disappears. It is continuing after heartbreak. It is standing back up when the world celebrates your failures. That is what shaped me. Not comfort, pain. If you only study my goals, you will never understand me. If you only study my trophies, you will miss the truth completely. Because my story was never only about football. It was about survival. A poor boy trying to outrun limitation. A son trying to make his mother proud. A man fighting time, criticism, pressure, and himself. And maybe that is why people connected to my story. Not because I was perfect, but because I refused to surrender. Even when exhausted. Even when hated. Even when broken.
E em Cristiano Ronaldo.
And the greatest opponent I ever faced was never another player. It was the fear of becoming nothing again. There comes a point in life where success no longer excites you the same way. Not because you stop loving it, but because you begin understanding the cost. And by then, you already paid too much to walk away. That was where I found myself. Not chasing football anymore. Chasing meaning. Imagine waking up every day knowing the entire world expects greatness from you. Not sometimes. Every time. That pressure changes a person. Even silence becomes difficult. Because people analyze everything. Your expression. Your body language. Your family. Your emotions. Your failures. When you become famous enough, people stop seeing you as a human being. You become public property. And slowly, your real self begins disappearing behind the image. People always called me confident. Arrogant sometimes. But confidence is often misunderstood. Confidence is not believing you are unbeatable. Confidence is training so hard that fear no longer controls you. Because the truth is, I felt fear constantly. Fear before games. Fear of injuries. Fear of decline. Fear of disappointing millions. I just learned how to hide it better than most people. That became my armor. Smile outside. War inside. At one point, records stopped feeling emotional. Another goal. Another trophy. Another headline. And people celebrated like it was normal. That is the strange thing about greatness. The world gets used to your miracles. What once shocked people becomes expectation. And expectation is dangerous. Because eventually you stop asking, "Am I successful?" and start asking, "Who am I without success?" That question haunted me more than any defender ever could. I sacrificed balance for excellence. That is the truth. There were birthdays I missed. Moments with family I could never recover. Normal experiences I never had. Because my entire life became routine. Wake up. Train. Recover. Repeat. Again. 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 The world saw discipline. But obsession and discipline are very close relatives. And sometimes I could no longer tell the difference. Football changed. The internet changed everything. Now criticism did not stay in newspapers. It entered your phone. your home, your private moments. Millions of opinions every single day. People speaking about your life as if they knew you personally. Some loved me deeply. Others hated me passionately. But hate is strange. Sometimes people hate you because your existence reminds them of what they never became. I learned not to absorb it. Because if you consume enough negativity, eventually it starts consuming you. Every footballer dreams of lifting the World Cup. For me, it became more than a dream. It became unfinished business. Every tournament carried enormous pressure. People expected miracles. And when miracles did not happen, disappointment became global. That is the burden of icons. You are remembered more for what you failed to achieve than for everything you already conquered. And that pain stays with you long after the stadium empties. One of the hardest moments of my career was not losing. It was sitting, watching, feeling time moving without me. Athletes are taught to fight, to dominate, to lead. So when the game continues without you, it feels like death in slow motion. And for the first time in many years, I was forced to confront something terrifying. I was becoming vulnerable, not physically, emotionally. Even after all the success, the child inside me never disappeared. The poor boy from Madeira still existed, still hungry, still afraid, still desperate to prove himself. Maybe that is why I never relaxed fully. Because when you grow up unstable, your mind struggles to trust success. You keep preparing for disaster. Even when life improves, trauma teaches survival before peace. And survival became my identity. There is something dangerous about becoming legendary. People begin expecting you to stop being human. No weakness, no sadness, no aging, no mistakes. But legends still bleed, still grieve, still break internally. And sometimes I wondered if the world loved me, or only loved what I could produce for them. Goals, victories, entertainment. Because once performance drops, applause becomes quieter. That realization hurts more than people understand. One night, after a match, I sat alone. The stadium was empty. The noise was gone. And for the first time in a long time, I looked backward instead of forward. I thought about my mother, my father, my childhood, the streets, the hunger, the fear. And suddenly I realized something emotional. I survived everything that was supposed to destroy me. Poverty, pressure, grief, criticism, loneliness, expectation. I survived it all. Not perfectly, but completely. People think my greatest strength was physical ability. It wasn't. My greatest strength was endurance. The ability to continue when mentally exhausted. To continue after humiliation, after pain, after loss, after global criticism. Most people can handle success. Very few people can survive the psychological weight that comes with sustaining greatness for decades. That was the real battle. Eventually I stopped trying to prove myself to everyone. That is maturity. You realize peace matters more than validation. I still loved winning. Still loved football. Still loved competition. But I no longer needed universal approval. Because approval is temporary. Legacy is permanent. And legacy is built through consistency over time. Not through one perfect moment. Athletes age. Bodies slow down. Careers end. That is reality. But some stories outlive the body. Some names survive generations. Not because they were flawless, but because they represented something larger than sport. And I think that is why my story connected globally. Because millions of people saw themselves in the struggle. The outsider. The doubted child. The dreamer. The survivor. That was always bigger than football. If one day people forget my goals, I hope they remember my mentality. The refusal to quit. The discipline. The resilience. The hunger. Because talent alone never creates greatness. Mentality does. I was not born extraordinary. I was shaped by pressure. Built through sacrifice. Forged through pain. And every scar became part of the legend.
Cristiano Ronaldo.
A boy from Madeira who carried poverty in his heart and turned it into fuel. And long after the stadium lights fade, long after the crowds disappear, one thing will remain true: I never stopped fighting. Some people are born into comfort, others are forged by struggle. Cristiano Ronaldo was never supposed to become a legend. But pain created discipline, discipline created greatness, and greatness created immortality. If this story inspired you, if it reminded you to keep fighting, if it showed you that your beginning does not decide your ending, then subscribe now to become part of the JANICEFBAPS Studios Productions family. Because here, we do not just tell stories, we uncover the pain behind greatness, the darkness behind success, and the human soul behind the legends the world thinks it already knows. Like, comment, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more cinematic documentaries, emotional true stories, psychological storytelling, and powerful journeys from the world's greatest icons. This is not just content, this is legacy storytelling. JANICEFBAPS Studios Productions, where pain becomes power.
The man who turned dirt into hope. George Washington Carver. People saw dirt. I saw life. They saw a peanut. I saw possibility. They saw a poor black child born into slavery. But God showed me purpose. My name is George Washington Carver. And this is my story. I was born around 1864 in Diamond, during one of the darkest periods in American history. My mother was enslaved. My father died before I ever knew him. Before I could even understand the world. The world introduced me to suffering. One night, raiders came to our farm. They kidnapped my mother, my sister, and me. I was only a baby. A man was eventually sent to recover us. But only I was brought back. Sick. Weak. Barely alive. My mother never returned. And for the rest of my life, I wondered where she went. Whether she survived. Whether she ever thought about me. I grew up small and frail. Too weak to walk the fields like the others. So while many labored, I wandered. I explored forests, flowers, plants, rocks, and trees. Nature became my escape from loneliness. But slowly, it also became my teacher. I listened carefully to creation. I studied every leaf, every root, every dying flower. People in the neighborhood began calling me the plant doctor. They would bring me sick plants. And somehow, I found ways to make them bloom again. Even as a boy, I believed God had hidden secrets inside nature. And I wanted to uncover them. But there was a problem. I was black. And in those days, education was not meant for someone like me. Still, I wanted to learn more than anything else in the world. So I left home, alone. I traveled from town to town searching for schools that would accept a black child. Sometimes I slept in barns. Sometimes in abandoned buildings. Sometimes hungry. Sometimes cold. But every rejection only strengthened my determination. I washed clothes, cooked meals, cleaned houses, did whatever I needed to survive. Not because life was easy, but because purpose kept pulling me forward. For a time, I studied art. I loved painting flowers and landscapes. The beauty of nature fascinated me. I attended Simpson College to study art and music. But one of my teachers looked at my flower paintings and told me something that changed my life forever. She said, "George, why don't you study the flowers themselves?" That sentence redirected my destiny. I transferred to Iowa State University. There, I became the first black student on campus. Later, the first black faculty member. I studied agriculture, botany, and science. Not because I wanted fame. Not because I wanted wealth. I wanted to help poor farmers. especially black farmers trapped in poverty after slavery. The soil in the South had been destroyed by endless cotton farming. Year after year, the land grew weaker. And when the land weakened, families suffered. Children starved. Hope disappeared. Then one day, Booker T. Washington invited me to join Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. I accepted. Not for money. Not for status. But because I believed knowledge should serve people. At Tuskegee, I began teaching farmers to rotate crops. Instead of planting cotton every year, I encouraged them to grow peanuts, sweet potatoes, and soybeans. The farmers were uncertain at first. Some laughed at the idea. But slowly, the soil began healing. And as the soil healed, the people healed too. I spent countless hours experimenting in laboratories, studying crops, searching for possibilities hidden inside ordinary things. People later said I invented hundreds of products from peanuts and sweet potatoes, oils, soap, paint, dyes, medicines, industrial materials. But the peanut itself was never my true mission. My mission was to show poor people that value can come from places the world ignores. Because I understood that feeling personally. The world often overlooks what appears small, broken, or unimportant. But I learned something powerful. God hides greatness inside unlikely places. Soon newspapers began writing about me. Politicians invited me to speak. Business leaders sought my advice. I even stood before the United States Congress to speak about agriculture and the value of peanuts. And for perhaps the first time in their lives, many powerful men sat quietly and listened to a black scientist. Not because the world had suddenly become fair, but because excellence became impossible to deny. Still, I never cared much for fame. I wore simple clothes, lived simply, worked constantly, because purpose mattered more to me than recognition. People often asked how I discovered so many things. My answer surprised them. I told them I asked God. You see, I never separated science from faith. To me, every flower, every tree, every seed revealed the fingerprints of the Creator. Science was simply the study of God's imagination. As the years passed, my body grew weaker, but my desire to teach never faded. Young students came to learn from me, not just about plants, but about life. I told them not to chase money. I told them not to waste life seeking importance. Instead, be useful, be valuable, serve others. Because success without service is empty. In 1943, I fell down a staircase. Soon after, my life came to an end. But purpose does not die with the body. And neither does impact. I was born into slavery. But I refused to let slavery define my spirit. I lost my mother. But I found meaning. I faced rejection. But rejection became direction. And if my life proves anything, it is this. Greatness does not begin with opportunity. It begins with vision. The world may see dirt, while God sees destiny. There were moments in my life when exhaustion nearly defeated me. Moments when loneliness sat beside me like a shadow. People saw the speeches, the recognition, the newspaper headlines. But they did not see the nights I walked alone in silence, surrounded by bottles, plants, soil samples, and unanswered questions. At Tuskegee Institute, resources were limited. Our laboratories were small. Equipment was old. Sometimes I created experiments using scraps and discarded materials others considered useless. But hardship teaches creativity. When you have little, you learn how to make something from almost nothing. And perhaps that is why I understood the peanut so well. People laughed at peanuts. ignored them, looked down on them. Much like they looked down on poor black farmers. Much like they looked down on me. But hidden value does not disappear simply because the world refuses to recognize it. I wanted farmers to understand something powerful. The ground beneath their feet was not cursed. It was exhausted. And exhausted things do not need judgment. They need restoration. So I traveled across the South teaching struggling farmers how to rebuild the soil. I carried charts, seeds, plants, hope. Sometimes I demonstrated farming techniques directly in the fields. Other times, I brought knowledge to people who had never been allowed access to education before. I even designed a movable classroom called the Jessup Wagon, a traveling agricultural school that carried tools, crops, and lessons to poor rural communities. To many people, it was just a wagon. To me, it was freedom on wheels. Because knowledge should never belong only to the wealthy. It should reach the forgotten, the overlooked, the abandoned. As my reputation grew, important people invited me into rooms where men who looked like me were rarely welcomed. I met presidents, scientists, industrial leaders. But fame never erased reality. There were hotels I could not enter because I was black. Restaurants that refused to serve me. Train cars that reminded me exactly how America still viewed people like me. Success does not always protect you from prejudice. Sometimes it only exposes it more clearly. Still, I refused to become bitter. Bitterness poisons the soul slowly. And I had already seen enough suffering in this world. Instead, I chose purpose. Again and again. I woke before sunrise most mornings. Walked through nature. Prayed quietly. Studied flowers as if they were living messages from God. Because I truly believe creation held answers humanity had not yet learned to hear. People often search for complicated explanations behind my discoveries. But my process was simple. Observe carefully. Listen patiently. Remain humble enough to learn from small things. That is how miracles often begin. Not with noise, but with attention. Over time, students began looking at me not just as a scientist, but as proof. Proof that a black child born during slavery could rise beyond the limitations society placed upon him. Proof that intelligence has no color. Proof that purpose can survive pain. I understood the weight of that responsibility. Because every step I took, I knew others were watching, hoping, wondering if doors closed for generations could finally begin to open. And slowly, they did. Not fast enough. Not fully. But enough for the next generation to walk further than mine could. That was always my dream. Not simply to succeed personally, but to leave the road wider for those coming after me. Because real greatness is not measured by how high one man rises, but by how many others rise because he lived. Music slowly swells. I once said, when you can do the common things of life in an uncommon way, you will command the attention of the world. But what I truly meant was this. Never underestimate what God can do with an ordinary life surrendered to purpose. Not every revolution begins with armies. Some begin with seeds. Some begin with soil. And some begin with a lonely child wandering through fields, searching for beauty in a broken world. As I grew older, the world began calling me a genius, an inventor, a scientific pioneer. But titles never impressed me. Because deep inside, I still remember the frightened little boy searching for his mother in the darkness. Pain leaves echoes inside a person. No amount of success completely silences them. There were nights when memories returned vividly. The feeling of abandonment, the uncertainty, the ache of never truly knowing where I came from. Slavery had stolen more than freedom from people like us. It stole names, histories, families, identity. Many of us grew up carrying empty spaces inside our hearts where answers should have been. Perhaps that is why I spent so much of my life searching nature for understanding. Because plants did not judge. The soil did not hate. Flowers did not care about race. Creation accepted what humanity rejected. And in many ways, nature became the closest thing I had to peace. At Tuskegee Institute, students often watched me closely. Some expected a stern scientist. Others expected a famous intellectual. Instead, they found a quiet man carrying plants through hallways, speaking gently to flowers, and treating even the smallest forms of life with respect. Because I believed humility was the beginning of wisdom. The louder a man becomes, the less he truly listens. And listening had given me everything. I listened to struggling farmers. I listened to damaged land. I listened to the quiet patterns hidden inside creation. Most importantly, I listened to God. People frequently asked why I never chased wealth from my discoveries. The truth was simple. I never believed knowledge belonged to one person alone. Many companies wanted ownership of my work. Some offered money. Others promised fame beyond anything I had known. But I had already seen what greed does to humanity. I watched people exploit land until it died. Exploit workers until they collapsed. Exploit each other until compassion disappeared. I did not want my life to become another example of taking without giving back. So I shared my discoveries freely whenever possible. Because helping people mattered more to me than becoming rich. And perhaps that confused the world. In America, success was often measured by wealth. But I measured success differently. Did your life heal others? Did your work leave people better than you found them? Did your existence create hope where there was once despair? If the answer was yes, then your life had meaning. As the years passed, my health slowly weakened. My hands became older. My body moved slower. But my curiosity never faded. Even in old age, I continued experimenting, continued teaching, continued searching for hidden possibilities inside ordinary things. Because wonder keeps the spirit alive. I feared becoming spiritually old far more than physically old. One day, a young student asked me something I never forgot. He said, "Professor Carver, how did you become so strong after everything you survived?" I looked at him quietly for a long moment. Then I answered, "I decided long ago that I would not allow hatred to grow inside me. That was the real battle of my life. Not science. Not poverty. Not racism. Bitterness. Because suffering can either deepen your wisdom or poison your soul. And I had seen too many people destroyed from the inside out. So I chose forgiveness repeatedly. Not because injustice was acceptable, but because hatred changed the wounded to their pain forever. And I wanted freedom. Real freedom. The kind no man could take away. Soft piano grows emotional. In my final years, I spent more time reflecting, thinking about the strange journey my life had become. A child born into slavery, standing before presidents, a sickly orphan, changing agriculture across a nation, a lonely boy who once wandered fields searching for flowers, becoming someone remembered around the world. It all felt impossible. And perhaps that is why I remained humble. Because I knew my life was evidence of grace. Not just talent. Grace. I often told students, fear of something is at the root of hate for others. And America was still deeply afraid. Afraid of equality. Afraid of change. Afraid of confronting the evil buried inside its own history. But I believed knowledge could challenge fear. Education could weaken ignorance. Compassion could heal division. Slowly. Painfully slowly. But still, progress was possible. And if my life served any purpose beyond science, I hope it proved this. Human value is not determined by race, poverty, status, or the opinions of society. Value is placed inside every soul by God Himself. No human being has the authority to erase that. Music slowly rises into a hopeful orchestral swell. Even now, long after my hands have turned to dust, I hope people remember that greatness is often hidden beneath suffering. That broken beginnings do not decide final destinations. That even wounded lives can grow something beautiful. Because the Creator specializes in transforming forgotten things into living miracles. And I was one of them. Near the end of my life, people often asked me what invention I was most proud of. They expected me to mention peanuts, or paints, or medicines. But my answer was always different from what they imagined. My greatest work was never a product. It was people. Watching poor farmers regain hope after years of failure. Watching students believe in themselves for the first time. Watching young black children realize their minds carried brilliance the world could not erase. Those were the moments that mattered most to me. Because inventions may change industries, but encouragement changes lives. There were times when I walked alone across the Tuskegee campus late at night. The air quiet, the trees still, the stars hanging over Alabama like distant lanterns. And in those silent moments, I often thought about how close I had come to disappearing into history unnoticed. A kidnapped slave child. Weak. Sickly. Forgotten. The world had every reason to expect nothing from me. But expectation is not destiny. Many people surrender because others fail to see their value. I understand that pain deeply. When society repeatedly tells you that you are less, unworthy, invisible, eventually those voices begin echoing inside your own mind. That is the most dangerous prison of all. Not chains on the body, but chains wrapped around belief. And I spent much of my life trying to break those chains. Not only for myself, but for others. I wanted young black students to see education differently. Not as a privilege reserved for the powerful, but as a weapon against limitation. Knowledge gives language to dreams. It gives courage to the overlooked. It gives dignity to those the world tries to silence. That is why teaching became sacred to me. Every lesson carried possibility. Every student carried unseen greatness. Some simply needed someone to believe in them long enough for that greatness to awaken. I understood that better than most. Because throughout my journey, certain people opened doors for me when society demanded those doors remain shut. A teacher who encouraged my art. A mentor who recognized my potential. A community willing to let a wandering boy study instead of surrender. No one rises entirely alone. Even the strongest trees begin as fragile seeds protected by unseen hands. As my fame spread internationally, letters arrived from around the world. Scientists praised my discoveries. Leaders invited me to conferences. Reporters called me extraordinary. But praise can become dangerous if a person begins believing he is greater than others. So I stayed close to simple things. Gardens. Prayer. Nature. Silence. Because simplicity protects the soul from arrogance. And arrogance destroys wisdom faster than ignorance ever could. The older I became, the more convinced I was that humanity had lost its connection to creation. People moved faster, wanted more, consumed endlessly, yet rarely stopped long enough to truly observe the world around them. A single flower contains astonishing beauty. A seed contains hidden power. Soil itself carries mysteries deeper than many realize. And still, human beings often destroy what they do not pause to appreciate. Perhaps that is why the land suffered. And perhaps that is why people suffered too. We had forgotten how to live in harmony with what God created. I believed restoration involved more than crops. The soil needed healing. Yes. But so did the human spirit. A nation scarred by slavery needed healing. Communities divided by hatred needed healing. People carrying generations of pain needed healing. And healing begins the moment someone believes change is possible. That belief alone can rescue a person from despair. Music grows darker and more emotional. But despite everything I accomplished, I remained aware of the reality surrounding me. There were brilliant black minds never given opportunity. Inventors history ignored. Dreamers crushed by racism before their gifts fully emerged. I carried their memory with me. Because for every person remembered by history, thousands disappear unseen. And I never wanted success to blind me to those still suffering quietly. That is why I spoke often about service. Your talent means little if it serves only yourself. Your knowledge means little if it never uplifts others. A life consumed entirely by personal ambition eventually becomes empty. But a life poured into others, that kind of life echoes beyond death. Soft choir enters quietly. As I approached my final days, I no longer feared dying. I had walked through too much darkness to fear the unknown. What mattered to me was whether my life had planted seeds that would continue growing after I was gone. Seeds of knowledge. Seeds of dignity. Seeds of hope. Because that is how true change survives. One life touches another. Then another. Then another. Until eventually, an entire generation rises stronger than the one before it. And perhaps that was my real purpose all along. Not simply to study plants, but to remind humanity that growth is always possible. Even after destruction. Even after suffering. Even after years of being told nothing good can come from your existence. Life can still bloom from wounded ground. I know. Because I did. Long emotional pause. And somewhere tonight, there is still a lonely child staring at a broken future, believing their life has no value. If my story reaches them, I hope they understand this. Your beginning does not define your ending. The world may overlook you now, but buried things still grow. And sometimes, the most extraordinary miracles begin beneath the surface, where nobody is looking. History often remembers achievements, but forgets the emotional cost behind them. People saw me standing before crowds, speaking with confidence, teaching students, meeting powerful leaders. But very few understood how deeply loneliness shaped my life. There is a certain isolation that comes from constantly being the first. The first black student. The first black professor. The first black scientist many people had ever respected. Being first means walking into rooms carrying the weight of generations behind you. Every mistake becomes magnified. Every success becomes questioned. Every step feels watched. And when society already doubts your worth, the pressure becomes exhausting. I carried that pressure quietly. I learned early that survival sometimes required silence, calmness, patience. Not because I lacked anger, but because anger alone could not build the future I hoped to see. So instead of allowing pain to consume me, I poured my energy into creation, into teaching, into healing damaged soil and damaged spirits alike. Still, there were moments when the burden became heavy. Moments when I questioned whether humanity would ever truly change. I saw hatred pass from one generation to another like inheritance. Children learning prejudice before compassion. Communities divided by fear. People destroying one another over skin color while standing beneath the same sky created by the same God. And yet, despite witnessing humanity at its worst, I could never completely lose faith in people. Because I had also seen kindness. Quiet kindness. The kind history rarely celebrates. Strangers who fed me when I was hungry. Teachers who encouraged me when others rejected me. Students who carried hope in their eyes despite living in a world determined to limit them. Those moments reminded me that darkness never fully erases light. Not completely. At Tuskegee Institute, I often encourage students to look beyond what society expected from them. The world already placed enough limits on black lives. I did not want their own minds becoming additional prisons. I told them to think creatively, to observe deeply, To trust their intelligence even when others refuse to acknowledge it. Because oppression survives by convincing people they are powerless. The moment a person recognizes their own value, something powerful awakens inside them. And awakened minds are difficult to control. That truth frightened many people during my lifetime. Education threatened systems built on ignorance. Knowledge challenged injustice. A thinking generation could no longer be easily manipulated. Perhaps that is why access to education had been denied to so many for so long. Because ignorance protects oppression. But knowledge creates transformation. That belief guided my entire life. Not simply scientific knowledge, but spiritual wisdom too. I believed humanity suffered not only from intellectual poverty, but moral poverty. People had learned how to build industries, while forgetting how to love each other. Learned how to accumulate wealth, while neglecting compassion. Learned how to conquer land, while destroying the very earth sustaining them. Progress without wisdom becomes dangerous. And I feared the world was moving faster than its conscience could handle. Low emotional strings deepen. There were times when reporters asked me how I remained hopeful after enduring racism for so many years. The answer was difficult to explain. Hope was not blindness. I saw injustice clearly. I felt humiliation deeply. I understood cruelty personally. But I also understood something else. Hatred depends on convincing wounded people to become wounds themselves. I refused. I refused to let bitterness reshape my spirit into something ugly. Because once hatred enters the heart, it begins destroying the person carrying it from within. And I had already survived too much destruction. So I chose another path. Service. Curiosity. Faith. Forgiveness. Not weakness. Forgiveness requires tremendous strength, especially when pain is deservedly justified. But I discovered that peace cannot grow inside a soul consumed entirely by resentment. And peace mattered to me more than revenge ever could. As age slowly overtook me, I spent more time alone with my thoughts, reflecting, praying, walking quietly through gardens, watching the sunrise over Alabama fields. There is something humbling about nature. The seasons continue regardless of human pride. Flowers bloom without demanding applause. Trees give shade without asking who deserves it. Creation understands balance better than humanity often does. And perhaps that is why I trusted nature so deeply. It revealed truths people complicated unnecessarily. Life requires patience. Growth takes time. Healing begins beneath the surface long before visible results appear. The same was true for society. Change was happening. Slowly. Painfully slowly. But still happening. Each student educated. Each farmer restored. Each barrier broken. Each mind awakened. These were seeds planted into the future. And seeds do not bloom overnight. Soft hopeful music rises. I often wonder what my mother would think if she could have seen my journey. Would she recognize the frightened child stolen from her arms? Would she believe that same child would one day inspire millions? I never found answers to those questions. But perhaps some mysteries remain unresolved for a reason. Not every wound fully closes. Some remain tender throughout life. Yet even wounded hearts can produce extraordinary compassion. In many ways, my pain became the soil where empathy grew. Because suffering teaches you to recognize suffering in others. And once you truly recognize it, you cannot ignore it anymore. That understanding shaped everything I became. Scientist, teacher, mentor, servant. Not because I was extraordinary, but because brokenness taught me how deeply humanity needed healing. If people remember me generations from now, I hope they remember more than inventions, more than peanuts, more than laboratories. I hope they remember a man who believed every human life carried hidden worth. A man who believed wisdom should serve humanity, A man who transformed pain into purpose instead of poison. Because that transformation, that choice, may be the greatest miracle of all. Screen fades slowly into darkness. This has been another powerful story from JANICEFBAPS Studios Productions, where forgotten voices live forever.